involved in this and interested in participating, so we are excited to have you here. My name is Margot Granite. Probably most of you have seen my name somewhere associated with this session and the initiative, Gender Mainstreaming in Fisheries of the Caribbean. I'm the team lead for this project that is being run by CRFM, the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, and our team is a part of the NGen Collaborative, which is a consortium of consultants. I am joined by my colleagues Emmett Boyer, who you already saw and heard from. Thank you very much, Emmett. And also my colleagues Molly Gilligan and Melissa Luna, who we will hear from later on in the session. Among our team, we have over 40 years of experience in gender equality and social inclusion in various environmental sectors and sustainable development. And we have done lots of capacity building in our work. And since February 2020, we have been working with CRFM on this initiative to advance gender issues, decent work, and youth involvement in the sustainable development of fisheries in the Caribbean. Our work has included various efforts including conducting desk research and stakeholder consultations, which many of you will have been a part of already. We've been analyzing the findings from those consultations and research and identifying priority areas. We have developed a gender action plan for CRFM and a regional strategy. And of course, right now we are working on building capacity on gender mainstreaming, which we are excited to get underway with this first session and continuing over the next few weeks. With the onset of COVID, we have adapted this methodology, of course, on these items. And whereas we had been planning initially to be in country and connecting with all of you in person to engage and build understanding on gender mainstreaming and issues in the Caribbean fisheries sector, we are glad to be able to have you all participate virtually today. This is the first of several virtual capacity building sessions under this initiative. Information on the other sessions has been shared over email already, and we will reshare those links and information along with the recording and materials for this session at the end. And we will be discussing a few different elements relevant to the initiative today with the following goals of the session. To understand gender concepts and the importance of gender equality, we will go through gender inequality globally and in the Caribbean, some terminology review and explanation on key concepts, and also the fisheries between gender and, the linkages between gender and fisheries. And then the other goal for our session today is to strengthen the understanding of gender mainstreaming in the project cycle, where we will discuss entry points for gender responsive actions along the project cycle and also the benefits of mainstreaming gender before breaking out into smaller groups to discuss some of the specific actions and entry points that you all could be undertaking at the national and subnational level as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Molly to introduce us in the first technical session.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Margot. Just before I start, a quick reminder to feel free to use the chat session at the bottom of your screen for questions throughout the next few sessions. And also my section will have a few of those polls, so just be on your toes a little bit to think about what you view the answers might be. They're just for fun, they're just to be engaged, and so you'll see those throughout. So again, hi everyone, I'm Molly Gilligan. I'm thrilled to be with all of you this morning. We're going to start out this session by examining gender inequality to understand why it's important for sustainable development. I'll note that there are a few sensitive topics such as gender-based violence, so please do take care of yourself throughout. Gender inequality is among the most pervasive forms of discrimination in the world, affecting all aspects of life, from education and income to rights and access to resources and services. This impacts the potential of all people, their safety, and livelihoods. Achieving gender equality is not only a matter of human rights, but it is also internationally recognized as an integral part of long-term sustainable development goals, including within international and regional frameworks, which we'll discuss in next week's session. Despite its importance, there's still a lot of work to be done to achieve gender equality around the world. Today, we'll discuss a few examples of gender inequality globally and within the Caribbean. So disasters, including hurricanes, floods, droughts, wildfires, and earthquakes affect over 150 million people and result in tens of thousands of deaths every year. Due to social and economic inequalities and norms, women have a harder time coping with and recovering from natural disasters compared to men. And women and children are 14 times more likely to die during a disaster. Many factors contribute to this inequality. In some regions, girls are not taught to swim while boys are, leaving women and girls more vulnerable to floodwaters. In other regions, women are not allowed to leave the house without being accompanied by a male relative, so they might not evacuate dangerous areas in time. Additionally, women are often caregivers responsible for children and the elderly, which may pose challenges and barriers to timely evacuation. In recovery situations, women are more likely to experience gender-based violence in communities and emergency shelters, or may not have access to adequate gender-sensitive facilities. Given all of this, in 2015, what percentage of funding to states most impacted by disasters went to women's groups or women's ministries? So you should see a poll question soon. In other words, funds to specifically help women and their families respond to and recover from disasters. So here's your poll question. We'll give you a few seconds to think about what you think the answer is. Okay, we'll give just a few more seconds here. Okay, many of you are correct. The answer here is 1%. So that's only 1% of funding goes to specifically support women and families respond to and recover from disasters. Thanks for the poll, Emmett. Okay, gender-based violence, including but not limited to intimate partner violence, is a major issue for communities around the world. Over 33% of women will experience some form of gender-based violence in their lifetime, and 18% of women and girls experience violence from an intimate partner in 2019. This number will likely be higher this year due to the global pandemic. Gender-based violence is violence that weaponizes gender norms and stereotypes to enforce imbalanced power dynamics. Gender-based violence is a major barrier to gender equality, threatening the autonomy, health, and lives of survivors and victims. Yet perpetrators often act with impunity, and there's widespread social stigma with reporting and seeking justice for violence. This social stigma against reporting is particularly felt by men and boys who are victims of sexual or intimate partner violence, as social norms of masculinity may contribute to feelings of shame or weakness. Appropriate services and resources need to be available so that people of all gender identities do not fear reporting violence and seeking justice. It's important to note that men and boys also experience specific vulnerabilities for violence, especially in times of disaster and conflict. In situations of armed conflict, for example, boys are at an increased risk of being taken as child soldiers and of sexual violence. Human trafficking is another related form of violence that can include sexual and labor exploitation, occurring in all regions of the world. 3 in 4 human trafficking victims are women and girls. Well, there has been some positive, we could go to the next one, yeah, thank you. Well, there's been some positive advancement in the last several decades. In the Caribbean, like in all regions of the world, women are still underrepresented in decision-making at all levels. As of June 2020, women make up 25% of representatives in national parliaments globally and 38.9% of representatives in national parliaments in Caribbean countries. In 2018, in most Caribbean countries, women made up less than 20% of ministerial cabinet positions, with the exception of Grenada at 40%. Women holding ministerial cabinet positions is an expression of the political will to promote gender parity in positions of political leadership. So inclusive representation in decision-making helps to bring diverse ideas, voices, experiences to the table toward innovative solutions to issues, including environmental and climate change related issues. One study found that countries with more women representatives in national parliaments led to these countries adopting more stringent climate change policies. Another study on women's representation in parliaments found that countries with more women representatives are also more likely to set aside protected land areas.
Just give us a little bit of a sense of how you're engaging them on your. So the three pillars from the SDCP, from that we work on throughout our work with CFYR, but through the AAA in particular, preventing and reducing crime, fostering.
The bottom line is that more inclusive decision-making and governance leads to better results for all. Thank you. Okay. So now we're going to move to education in the Caribbean. Education is an important factor in accessing opportunities, employment, income, and services and resources. On average, here's another poll for you. On average, what percentage of students taking final examinations in secondary and higher education are young women and girls? Okay, a few more seconds to think about your answers. All right, so 67% is the correct answer. So this is great, and it's just for fun. It's just so you all can think what you think is the answer. So education gains for women and girls have improved significantly around the world, and in some areas, including in much of the Caribbean, more girls achieve higher levels of education compared to boys. This could be due to various factors, including socialization of boys to pursue income-generating activities over education. It's important in tackling gender equality to address the barriers that boys may face in achieving higher education. It's also important to look at the outcome of this education. Does higher academic achievement equal more employment and income opportunities? The answer in the Caribbean for young women is not necessarily. Unemployment rates in the Caribbean is consistently high among young women at 33% compared to 21% for young men. One aspect of unemployment among young women is the societal expectation that they take primary responsibility for domestic tasks. Women in the Caribbean are responsible for 80% of domestic tasks, limiting their opportunity in participating in the formal labor force. Looking at income for women who are employed, women in the Caribbean earn an average of how much compared to men for performing the same type of work? Give you about 30 seconds to think of your answer. Okay, a few more seconds. Thanks for participating in these polls, everyone. All right, so this one was a little trickier to know the answer to. So the answer is actually women earn 17% less. And globally, the estimates for the gender pay gap are that women earn about 16 to 19% less than men. So the Caribbean is right on track with that global trend. According to an ILO report, some of the factors behind the gender pay gaps in the region with respect to the differentiated treatment of women include 3 mutually enforcing categories. Stereotypes, so presence of a variety of cognitive biases and discrimination. Behaviors, including aspirations, negotiation skills, and risk aversion. And social norms, such as gender division of labor and family arrangements. In Latin America and the Caribbean, 40% of women over the age of 18 do not have their own income, despite working on a daily basis. What percentage of these women work in the agricultural sector? One more quiz for you. with a big thank you to Emmett for running all of these quizzes.
So he had those skills in order, he got employed there. Another young man got.
Okay, so many of you thought it was 30%. The answer here is actually 80%. And this is a percentage that becomes even higher among Indigenous women, Afro-descendant women, and young women. Women play a critical role in maintaining food security for communities and households around the world. They spend significant time contributing to agricultural production, but their labor is often overlooked and underpaid, and their contributions diminished in economic analyses of the section. So that's a short background on gender inequality globally and in the Caribbean. Now I'll turn it over to Emmett, but with another reminder to use the chat feature below for any questions that you may have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Molly, for that overview of gender inequality. So this section, you know, as we saw in the first part of the section, gender equality is inequality is a pressing issue and something that we need to address globally and in the Caribbean. It's a widespread issue that has real impacts on people all over the world, and addressing inequality in sustainable development policies, programs, and projects leads to progress on gender equality, human rights, and more effective and long-term outcomes. So before we go on, we want to make sure that we talk a little bit about concepts and terminology to make sure that we're all on the same kind of page about what we're talking about and kind of the words that we see from major donors. So let's start off with, what do you think the definition of gender is? Is it A, and I'm going to start a poll while I'm reading this. Is it A, the socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities of girls, boys, women, boys, men, and gender diverse people? Or is it B, the biological aspects of humans and animals, including physical features, chromosomes, gene expressions, hormones, and anatomy? All right, I see a lot of people answering, that's good. Okay, so it looks like a lot of people got it right. The answer is A. Let's see. So why does this matter? Well, we often use gender and sex interchangeably, but really it's important to know that they're different things. While sex is assigned at birth and is determined by chromosomes, reproductive organs, and hormones, gender is social and cultural in nature rather than biological. And it is shaped by our perceptions of roles and responsibilities, attributes, and expressions and entitlements and rights that are associated with someone's gender, with being a man or a woman. Gender roles are not natural to men or women, and rather they are learned and imposed on by social values. And because of this, they vary widely among societies and change over time. If each of us made a list of what we think it means to be a man and what we think it means to be a woman, in general, our list might have some similarities, but I guarantee that all of them will be different in some way. And it's the same if we asked someone 50 years ago to make the same list and compared it to our list today. Gender roles, gender attributes, expressions change over time with our societies. And the fact that they are socially constructed means that they can change in ways to make society more equitable. And these gender roles, gender kind of attributes and expressions have different ways that kind of impact our perceptions of, and whether that's unconscious or conscious biases and stereotypes about what women and men are capable of. And that includes gender norms, maybe within society or the family, about what women are expected to do and men are expected to do. And they can also create harmful stereotypes and gender-based constraints that manifest in different areas of life and kind of limit opportunities in employment, leadership, income, and all these different areas. This includes in laws and practices, so discriminatory laws and practices that limit land rights for women, for example, is something that happens all over the world. Resources through practices that limit to access to or control over natural resources. So just who is capable of managing natural resources, who can access finances in order to improve agricultural practices, these kinds of things. And decision-making power, where certain people maybe aren't invited or they're overlooked in just making decisions, meaning that their opinions, their experiences, their knowledge isn't taken into consideration. And all of this results in the limited contributions and agency of particularly women when we're talking about gender-based constraints. So again, understanding that the fact that these gender attributes and these gender roles are changeable means that we can do something about these. We can do something about these constraints, and as a society make it more equitable so that everyone can participate and everyone can benefit, I guess, from these initiatives. So by understanding gender and how it shapes relations and power dynamics between people, we can tailor our work to ensure the needs of everyone is met and that people are affected by political processes and social development equally, while working to change harmful stereotypes and gender-based constraints that restrict the potential of women, men, boys, and girls. So that's why we want to understand the difference between gender and sex. And that's why it's important when we talk about gender equality. Gender equality and gender equity are two terms that we often also use interchangeably, but they mean slightly different things. So gender equality refers to the notion that rights, responsibilities, opportunities of individuals are not dependent on their gender. And gender equity refers to the process of treating women and men fairly according to their respective needs, which can include specific measures to compensate for those historical and structural disadvantages or gender-based constraints that we just talked about. So equity is often a means to true equality. While the goal is equality, it's not always possible to start with equality because women and men and girls and boys and people with differing access to different resources aren't starting on the same playing field. In our projects and programs, we often have to take an equity approach in order to reach equality. So many of you have probably seen that graphic where there's people standing behind a fence watching a baseball, or a wooden fence behind watching a baseball game, and then the boxes are redistributed. This is another graphical representation of what equity and equality looks like. So in the first panel, we have equality in resources. Everyone got the same bike. It didn't matter, what their needs were. So that meant that we didn't necessarily get equal outcomes because not everyone was starting on that same playing field in terms of distribution of resources. And in the second panel, we see that we have equity in resources. So we considered maybe the size of bike that people would need, the different kinds of bike that people would need, and that led to equal outcomes. And that's kind of the goal. We want to use equity in order to reach equality. And sometimes equity is necessary in our programs. Let's see, and really gender equality benefits everyone. It requires the equal enjoyment by women and men of socially valued goods and opportunities and resources and rewards. And entire communities benefit. No one loses out by gender equality. Men, women, and children and entire communities benefit when everyone has a voice and everyone has an opportunity. So importantly, I want to stop here and make sure that we understand that achieving gender equality isn't just about women. But as we saw, there is a lot of inequalities and barriers that place women in a vulnerable or disadvantaged position compared to men. So that is why a lot of the time when we are approaching gender equality and we're taking an equity approach, we look at what are the needs in society, and often that means that we have to kind of compensate for those historical gender imbalances. But men are also, this is a great quote that is in a UNIDO handbook, and it says that men are also subject to restrictive gender stereotypes about what they are supposed to do and how they are supposed to behave, which can limit their personal and professional life choices. And to achieve real gender equality, the whole of the population must support equal rights and opportunities for women and men. And it is crucial to also engage and involve and motivate men as part of the solution. And that's important. I think I've heard a lot throughout my career in gender equality and sustainable development that there's a feeling of disenfranchisement, a feeling of marginalization among men. And it isn't the goal of gender equality to make anyone feel marginalized. In fact, it's to make communities feel more empowered and feel the ability to take agency and to take control of what they want to do and seize opportunities, equal opportunities. And a part of that is that we have to engage men as active and positive participants in gender equality. And as Molly said before, there are gender gaps and barriers that affect men and boys differently than women and girls. And by taking down those stereotypes, we are making a more equitable and society for everyone. Let's see. So kind of on that note, I touched on it a little bit, but another word that we hear is empowerment, specifically women's empowerment. And gender equity approaches and reaching gender equality requires support at all levels, and that includes from individuals. And this is why we talk about empowerment. A critical aspect of promoting gender equality is the empowerment of women, with a focus on identifying and redressing power imbalances and giving women more autonomy to manage their own lives. It ensures that decision-making at private and public levels and access to resources are no longer weighted in men's favor compared to women, and so that both women and men can fully participate as equal partners in productive life. Excuse me. And this, the process of empowerment isn't something that you can give. You don't go to someone and say, you are now empowered. It is something that really is built and fostered in communities specifically. As project practitioners and as policymakers, we can kind of build in the enabling environments in order to support empowerment, but really it is an individual and societal manifestation. And if I could please remind everyone to keep their mics on mute so that we can limit the amount of background feedback. Great, thank you. And it doesn't necessarily always apply exclusively to women. It can apply to any marginalized group within a situation. We're talking about gender equality. So at this stage, I do want to talk a little bit about intersectionality. And this is another word that we hear a lot, but it might not necessarily kind of click about why we're talking about it. But intersectionality takes into account the interconnected nature of social identities as interdependent systems of experience, discrimination, or disadvantage. And excuse me, men and women aren't homogenous groups. And so we have to consider all the various identities that interact with our gender every day and how that shapes our experiences in the world. It can help us, taking an intersectional lens in our programming and our policymaking can help us address the complexity of problems that real people face in their daily lives. And I love this quote by Audre Lorde, a social activist and writer, a prominent social activist and writer, that says, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Every day when we live, we wear multiple hats of the identities that we hold and how communities and how societies interact with that." So when we think about intersectionality, we can think about our own unique experiences and circumstances, and those are shaped by our various social identities, such as race, gender, age, income, ethnicity, disability, and that kind of interact with one another and shape gives us a sense of who we are. And interacting with those is how society and how different people and institutions interact with those identities. We experience interacting forms of privilege and discrimination that impact how we interact with and move about the world and with others. And then all of this happens within a system that is set up by the dominant groups in society a larger kind of force and structures that are built around societal norms and constructed that kind of reinforce and exacerbate the inequalities, the discrimination, the privileges that we have based on our different identities. So this is kind of just like a quick intro to intersectionality, and just this is another polling question, and it is just a very basic, bit watered down polling question, but just to give you an idea of what intersectionality looks like. So which of these statements reflects an intersectional lens in developing a policy on disaster risk reduction? Do we think it's identifying communication networks in rural and urban communities to integrate early warning systems? Or do we think it's identifying accessible and preferred networks of communication for women and men of different socioeconomic levels in rural and urban communities and integrating those into early warning systems? So the poll is open right now. I see a lot of you answering. Okay, great. So it looks like a lot of us felt the same way, that the answer is B, and that is correct. So, excuse me. In other words, individuals' experiences and access to different resources shape their everyday lives. People can be many different identities. You can be a person can be Black, a woman, an elderly, and face racism, sexism, and ageism that kind of interact with one another. So when we're taking an intersectional lens in our programming, we want to make sure that we're improving the understanding of how gender relationships cross-cut with other factors and further shape someone's access to resources and services, their risk perception, and their awareness and ability to socially mobilize. And it helps us target policy interventions to particular groups of women and men who are most vulnerable. And it can also help us alert when maybe particular groups aren't involved in decision-making, and help us close those gaps as well. And so this is my last slide of this section. I know concepts and terminology can be a little bit hard to follow along with, but again, I want to remind everyone that we're giving these slides after the session so you can review, and we'll also give other resources that kind of dive a little bit deeper into this. So just to end on this section, the process of gender mainstreaming, so why we're all here today, and kind of the impetus of this consultancy of gender and fisheries in the Caribbean, gender mainstreaming in fisheries of the Caribbean. So we've talked about all these concepts and considerations of gender. We've talked about gender inequality and how it impacts our lives. But how can we progress towards gender equality in our projects? And the answer is gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming is a strategy for integrating gender concerns in the analysis, formulation, and monitoring of policies, programs, and projects. And it therefore is a means to an end. It's a process, not a goal. The purpose of gender mainstreaming is to promote gender equality and the empowerment of women in population and development activities. And this requires both addressing the condition as well as the position of women in men's society. Gender mainstreaming therefore aims to strengthen the legitimacy of gender equality by addressing known gender disparities and gaps in such areas such as the division of labor between women and the access into control of the resources. And we'll talk a bit more about this within the context of programs in a bit, but for right now, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to pass it on to Melissa Luna, my colleague Melissa Luna, to talk a bit about gender and fisheries linkages.
Thanks, Emmett. Hi, everyone. Good morning. So yes, my name is Melissa Luna, and very happy to be here this morning. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, to drop them into the chat below. And this morning, I'm going to be talking to you about gender and fisheries linkages and why they're important. We can move to the next slide. All right, so why look at gender and fisheries? While gender is just one part of someone's identity, and as Emmett talked about with intersectionality, gender, of course, isn't the whole picture, but it often strongly relates to how people use marine resources. So for example, women and men typically perform distinct roles and have distinct responsibilities according to their gender along the fish value chain. Men typically, though of course not exclusively, fish out at sea, while women tend to dominate in pre-harvest and post-harvest activities, like prepping bait and fishing gear, or processing and selling fish. And these differences mean that women and men have unique and differentiated knowledge, skills, and priorities and needs in the fishing sector. And not only are there differences in knowledge and skills, but gender also influences a lot of other factors, factors that are important for and affect fisheries management and development. So I wanted to do a quick little poll here. Okay. So just about if you could take a moment to look about what do you think gender influences? I'll give you a little bit more time. All right. Okay. So so gender, it's actually all of the above. So gender influences all of these things. Gender influences the ability to access resources, whether it be training or education, finances, credit, or income opportunities. It also influences the ability to engage and participate in decision-making. And all of that has an effect on how resilient or vulnerable a person is to environmental changes like climate change. I'll move to the next slide. All right, so this takes us to gender-based constraints, which Emmett already talked about a little bit. But gender-based constraints are related to the existing inequalities between women and men. So when we talk about gender-based constraints in fisheries, we often focus a lot on women, because while women and men both participate throughout the fish value chain, women's roles and contributions have been under-acknowledged and policy and management, which have prevented them from fully participating in economic opportunities and decision-making within the sector. And at play are a combination of factors, including discriminatory laws and cultural practices, constraining gender norms, and limited access to and control over resources. So some examples of this are that women do a lot of unpaid work, such as collecting bait, fixing nets, cooking food for fishers, and managing household accounts. And also women are, can also be engaged in subsistence nearshore fishing. And because of this, the income returns for their work is often lower than that of men's. And also women who are engaged in paid fisheries work are often placed in lower skilled positions or are employed under informal contracts, and therefore may have less legal protection for workplace hazards, less equitable pay, and may therefore be more susceptible to abuse and exploitation in the workplace and less able to fully exercise their legal rights. And gender norms regarding how women and men should behave can also be constraining, because they can limit women's access to more lucrative work in fish value chains and limit their participation in professional development related to the sector. But it can also inhibit men from taking on what are seen as more traditionally female roles in the fish value chain, and vice versa, which can lead to unrealized potential within the sector. And additionally, cultural norms about women expressing their opinions publicly may limit their ability to voice their concerns and needs in fisheries governance bodies, typically in areas where men take on that role. And lastly, time and travel burdens due to the domestic responsibilities that women have, such as childcare or caring for the elderly, that can restrict women's mobility and limit the time they have available to participate in meetings or workshops or trainings within fisheries. So we can move to the next slide. Okay. So why gender equality matters. So these gender-based constraints and challenges are significant because not addressing gender issues can lead to an undervaluation of the economic and social benefits that women and men provide. It can also lead to an underestimation of total catch and diversity of species harvested, which can complicate management. And it's also, inequities and inequalities also block different people's engagement in, contributions to, and benefits from a sector that is critical to poverty reduction and food security. And on the other hand, addressing gender issues can play a key role in bringing many potential benefits to the sector, including improved governance, ecological and sustainability outcomes. And when women and men are equally engaged, with each actor along the fish value chain having equitable access to professional training and resources, it can boost fishery production, it can reduce product loss and increase product value, leading to reductions in poverty and higher incomes, as well as enhance nutrition security for fish-dependent households. It also has an impact on women's empowerment, which Emmett talked about, which has a number of multiplier effects in a society, like driving up economic growth and development across the board. And in conclusion, women and men are interdependent parts of one system. So the difficulties that women and men each face affect the livelihood conditions of the whole, of all members of a community or a society. So this is why it's really important for programs and projects to be attuned to these gender differences and inequalities and designed to respond to them in order to have more effective and equitable outcomes. And with that, we'll move into some questions and answers and turn it over to Molly.
Thanks very much, Melissa. So just a quick reminder to add any questions to the chat box here. And I would suggest, since we're going to do breakout rooms later and we've only had a few questions in the chat box now, that you can all continue adding them here and we'll go through them and compile them. And I would suggest for us to save them for later. Margot, if that sounds good to you. Okay, great. So that's what we'll do. So keep adding questions to the chat. We'll have breakout rooms a little bit later where we'll be able to have smaller discussions. So feel free to ask questions then. And we can also save questions for a group discussion a little bit later on in the session. So thanks very much, everyone. And I will turn it over to Margot for the next session.
Great, thanks. Hello again, everyone. All right, well, we've heard lots of really interesting information already, some data and statistics from Molly, information about the concepts and terminology from Emmett, and of course the linkages from Melissa. And I know we said we weren't going to take any breaks, but just because I am realizing it's early and we all probably spend way too much time in front of our computers on Zoom calls right now, I want everybody to just take your hands, take your arms and stretch them up over your head for 2 seconds, just kind of wave them around, do a nice stretch, shake it out a little bit. We're gonna go into this next bit and it's going to take about 20 minutes and then we will go into our breakout groups. But so let's kind of maybe move your head around for a nice little stretch and we'll go back into gender mainstreaming in the project cycle and why we need to do this, but also how we actually do this. So there's a lot of mandates rolling around that we need to mainstream gender, and we've discussed these different ideas, but there's a lot of questions still on what does this actually look like in practice? And at the most basic level, gender mainstreaming implies simply being aware of the gender concerns and attempting to improve equality. In that way, anyone can and should participate in gender mainstreaming. Everyone has a role to play. So we've provided here some example stakeholders sharing why they or you might be interested to and the opportunities that exist for mainstreaming gender. We're also going to, as I said, run through this session, sharing the different entry points and some additional context on why and how to do that. And then we will have the opportunity to discuss the specific role you might have and the activities that you could conduct to ensure gender is mainstreamed. So we want to mainstream gender because evidence shows that when gender is mainstreamed, there are multiple benefits in social, economic, and environmental outcomes. These can range from enhancing women's and men's ability to realize their full potential, rights, and freedoms, reducing gender equality, which fosters greater social and economic prosperity, and decreasing the risk of violence, as well as improving outcomes of the projects that we're all a part of, as they are able to effectively respond to the needs of women and men. There are, of course, also risks wherever we find benefits. So when gender is inadequately mainstreamed, the risks associated when it's not comprehensively integrated or mainstreamed with limited approaches means that we may increase gender inequality by failing to take into account gender-based social dynamics. We could also jeopardize the efficiency and sustainability outcomes by failing to understand the whole picture. Or we could increase violence and conflict, including gender-based violence and domestic violence. So these are pieces that we certainly don't want to have. Even if they are unintentional, this is a reason that we have to consider gender. In striving toward gender equality, there are various levels of gender mainstreaming that need to be recognized and understood. When we're discussing gender being mainstreamed, we are considering the varying degrees of gender awareness when it comes to policy, program, and project development. From gender neutral, gender sensitive, gender responsive, and gender transformative, the spectrum of gender mainstreaming consciously increases the integration and uptake of gender awareness, leading toward gender equality, which Emmett shared a lot about, that is our end goal. These are likely some of the different terms you have heard to express concepts of gender mainstreaming. And with the exception of the first, gender neutral, these all signify being aware of the gender dynamics and issues, but consider and respond to them differently. These terms are often referenced in guidance by donors, but sometimes are used interchangeably without recognizing the nuanced differences. So we must build our understanding of these differences. So as the graphic shows, a gender neutral, or maybe you've also heard the term gender blind, approach ignores the social, economic, and political aspects that contribute to the power dynamics between women and men, girls and boys, and non-binary individuals. Gender blind approaches are often constructed based on the principles of being fair by treating everyone the same, but in reality, this can mean that there isn't equal participation and distribution of benefits. Unfortunately, gender blind can also mean that there was no consideration of gender and intersectional dimensions at all. Gender sensitive approaches indicate gender awareness, although often no remedial action is developed. An example of this would be that gender is considered, perhaps identified as an issue that needs to be recognized, but there is not action to address inequalities. Ignoring intersectionality of gender considerations may perpetuate, exacerbate, or even exploit existing gender inequalities. And so a focus on who matters, who decides, and who benefits is needed to effectively implement a more progressive or gender responsive approach. This approach, a gender responsive approach, considers and responds to the gender dynamics and issues. This intentionally targets and benefits intersectional groups of women, men, girls, and boys, and non-binary individuals based on their specific needs to achieve certain policy or program goals, moving further up the ladder toward gender equality. This makes it easier for people to actively participate and contribute to solutions by accommodating gender roles and responsibilities. This approach ensures that differential needs of women and men are valued and addressed, the participation of women and men is equitable, and that distribution of benefits, resources, status, and rights are equitably addressed. And this is the language that we are using most often in this initiative, because there is a transition of progress, and this is where we recognize as gender specialists where most of the development world is on implementing gender mainstreaming. So with respect to planning and integrating a gender responsive approach in fisheries, this recognizes that in addition to improving ecological outcomes, engaging women in fisheries is a meaningful opportunity to reduce gender inequalities and support women's economic empowerment. Integrated programming can strengthen key conservation and gender outcomes simultaneously when women are engaged as constituents and leaders for sustainable fisheries management, Women, men, girls, and boys can be empowered as effective stewards of fisheries and associated ecosystems, and they can also be engaged to become drivers towards sustainable fisheries markets. Now, a gender transformative approach seeks to address the root causes of gender inequality in the power structures and systems, and includes ways to actually change harmful gender norms and power relations. Transformative approaches will usher in gender equality as it is the overall goal, but it is important to remember the distinction between equity and equality here again, that was shared early in the session, where these elements and the stepped progress of each gender-aware level is important as a means toward the goal of gender equality. So if we think about this spectrum in regards to a gender analysis, which is a common tool used in gender mainstreaming efforts, how the information found in a gender analysis is employed in a project is crucial to actually contributing to gender equality. So a gender-sensitive approach means that there is recognition of the need for an analysis, and it may be conducted, but with considerations of the identified implications and issues. But in a gender-responsive approach, these issues, the gaps, challenges, and successes would be identified and then actively responded to through making changes in the activities, policies, or capacity building sessions and development that all stakeholders would be a part of. And a gender transformative approach takes this another step, and in these responses seeks the underlying change and transformation of systems and structures beyond just the sectoral approach, but comprehensive integration and response in implementing these changes. So part of the transformative approach looks at the systems in place, and for this reason, we also want to discuss the importance of different conditions which create an enabling environment for integrating a gender responsive approach or transformative approach more comprehensively. Creating an enabling environment for gender equality is part and parcel to sustainable development and advancements in fisheries of the Caribbean. The conditions that support an enabling environment are consistently and comprehensively institutionalized, preventing siloed policy and programming, but initiates a whole of government approach and civil society engagement to advance progress on women's rights and gender equality in theory and practice. By means of sound policies, I mean, you can, sorry, go ahead and, yeah, thanks. By the means of sound policies and legal frameworks, as well as financing investment structures, conditions are created which support gender mainstreaming comprehensively across systems, institutions, levels, and sectors. An enabling environment is not prescriptive, but necessitates and supports institutional arrangements to offer support mechanisms as well as regulation, accountability, and accountability of the policies and programs put in place. It also creates conditions which ensure sustainable and equitable development across sectors, because we know that gender is a cross-cutting issue, including in fisheries development and sustainability, while ensuring the rights and assets of all stakeholders, including public and private sector organizations, as well as women, men, youth, and their communities are ensured. So this includes, like on the slide here, various elements, including institutional arrangements, such as actively engaging gender machinery, which I am happy to say I saw several participants who are from our colleagues from the Gender Machinery Institutes in different countries in the Caribbean. And their engagement actively prioritizes their existence and input into the fisheries sector, as they are the experts on gender. We also want to encourage diverse stakeholder engagement as a critical piece to support equitable participation and active engagement of a range of entities. Harmonization of policies with consideration and inclusion of gender and national sectoral policies eliminates silos and creates opportunities for synergy and a more robust and comprehensive approach on gender and sustainable development. And it is imperative for financial resources to be allocated for the activities. Where lip service may be paid to gender mainstreaming and progress toward equality will not be well supported and sustained without the money and financial resources, as well as human resources and gender responsive budgeting. Adequate data collection is of course also important. As Molly shared, we are often limited by data and information, so collection and sharing of findings is essential. Many elements of an enabling environment, as shared here, are critical for broadly implementing gender equality and sustainable development agenda, but should also be included specifically and consistently throughout regional and national activities, including CRFMs and the National Fisheries Authority's policy, planning, and program implementation, as well as all relevant stakeholders in the fisheries sectors. To ensure conditions exist for an enabling environment, continuous awareness raising and capacity building is required and aids in the uptake of a gender responsive approach. And we're really trying to support that ownership for everyone to be able to mainstream gender yourselves. While some of these conditions to enable gender mainstreaming may not exist or vary in robustness at different levels and institutions, the following slides share examples of how to strategically address and mainstream gender in fisheries in the Caribbean. So we've identified these enabling conditions that support comprehensive and transformative change on gender equality. And here we are representing loosely the phases of a cycle of a project or process, be it policy or program development. We have planning, design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation, impact and learning, and how that feeds back into another cycle of planning, design, etc. And this is all very much an iterative process, as I'm sure we recognize having worked in this area, but we are going to follow this cycle in the next few slides. At each phase, it is important to recognize there are entry points to provide the data and information necessary and the skills for integrating gender for a more comprehensive and responsive approach. So in the planning phase, in order to most effectively mainstream gender, a gender responsive approach must be integrated comprehensively from the onset in the project cycle, starting with this phase. Gender issues and dynamics impact all aspects of the fisheries sector, including across the value chain. As such, gender must be understood and addressed within all fisheries programming in order to reach goals in this sector. This will have the added co-benefit of integrating progress toward gender equality and advancing women's empowerment together with ecosystem-based sustainable practices. Additionally, ensuring that women are meaningfully included in a project or program can support the overall success by incorporating women's skills and knowledge as stakeholders, practitioners, advocates, and agents of change. Therefore, the planning phase of a program should incorporate various tools, such as are highlighted here, including soliciting high-level commitment from parliamentarians or also directors or department heads. We want to map stakeholders, including gender equality advocates and actors, to be engaged. Undertaking an initial literature review on gender in the country, which looks at relevant gender analyses and existing sex disaggregated data, and reporting in other areas, such as the SDGs, is also important to inform this planning phase. And also, this contributes to an initial gender analysis, which could be the place where only the gender analysis exists in the cycle, but can also be further developed later on as needed. This should be conducted by gender experts, so engaging specialists from your country and regionally is important in this first phase as well, from the onset. And so we are going to have a quick question here on this phase for you to all participate in again. And it's just a true or false question. If after conducting a gender analysis, the findings should be integrated throughout a project, is this true or false? And we'll give you a couple seconds to respond. Okay, that looks great. And great job, everyone. Everyone agrees that this is true. We do want to conduct a gender analysis, but it should not be considered a box ticking exercise. We want to ensure that when this is carried out, the information from the analysis continues to contribute to all aspects of the project and is a very key part to inform the different cycles. And this moves on into design, which is especially relevant in the project design as it is a pivotal moment for mainstreaming gender. And the design stage is the final step of planning and acts as the kickoff point for implementation. At this point, gender must be mainstreamed across the policy priorities and program or project activities so that the implementers can fully embrace gender equality and women's empowerment as official goals and targets of the policy or program or project. So based on the findings from the previous planning activities, including the analysis, but also stakeholder consultation, a policy, project, or activities should be designed in consideration of and responding to these findings. This includes leveraging existing gender policies and commitments to create the mandate for integrating gender considerations across the policy project process. It can also include creating a gender action plan based on the analysis to be carried out throughout the project. Gender and human rights section usually are included now in project proposals, or if also as a cross-cutting issue within policy development on what considerations need to be included. And that is where also gender can be, main findings on gender analysis could be included there. But it's also sure to make sure, it is also important to make sure gender is integrated across the sections in either a proposal and considered comprehensively in policy development, so that it is not just siloed into one small summary paragraph on gender. And also to ensure that the targeted beneficiaries are not burdened additionally by project or policy goals, and that are equitable in participation and the benefits. This is a very key part here. So as the project ideas are formulated, it's critical to think about what gender considerations to bear in mind and can be implemented, which ones are tangible. Considering project proposals, ideas, and activities through a gender lens can help to identify how well gender considerations have been included, and if not, to also build upon those and identify which could be incorporated and enhanced to support implementation in the project. And in the implementation phase, through initial stakeholder engagement, thank you. It should be possible to identify the key stakeholders and their roles, perspectives, and needs, as well as identifying which stakeholders potentially have not been historically engaged. Stakeholder engagement and consultation does not end with the planning phase, but is very key here in the implementation as well. Stakeholders should be engaged and consulted to ensure that the goals of the project, both sustainability goals and gender equality goals, are being met. Stock should be taken throughout implementation to ensure that unintended consequences are not occurring that would derail the positive outcomes of implementation, by ensuring the findings from other project areas are integrating a gender perspective and actively identifying and responding with gender-specific activities. Even with comprehensive planning, an area of sustainability or gender equality may have been overlooked, or implementation may be impacting environments and communities in an unexpected way. So during this phase, and actually included as part of the stakeholders, gender experts should be involved, as in consultations, but also for conducting different activities and implementing the gender action plan if that was developed. And their engagement can eliminate the neutral or gender blind actions or unintended consequences that we've discussed earlier. Another key piece here is the training and capacity building for implementers, which gender experts should be sought after to conduct. It is important to build a capacity of fisheries specialists to understand the social implications of their work in terms of beneficiaries and stakeholders of the projects, and who may be impacted if the activities put restrictions on resource access. Without specific gender training, these specialists may have unintended community consequences due to their work, or may miss valuable ecological knowledge held by stakeholders such as women fisherfolk or natural resource managers. So we have another question, another true or false question for you, which is, if establishing gender quotas for activities is enough to ensure effective gender mainstreaming in projects, is this true or false? So establishing gender quotas is one mechanism to be put in place that can help to support gender mainstreaming, but is it the only thing we need to do? Okay, I think we can close that poll. Everyone responded quite well, realizing that yes, quotas are important. However, they are not the only tool that we want to include for mainstreaming gender. Okay. So the next phase of monitoring and evaluation. And we'll delve a bit deeper into this in our next session, actually, as it is a very complex and comprehensive phase, which actually does begin at that beginning planning and is of course incorporated into the design phase as well. But we are going to include a bit of overview here to show what elements could be integrated to support gender mainstreaming. So that When data is being collected, it is also important to note that we want to have equitable representation of monitoring teams to ensure that those providing data and information are comfortable and confident in sharing their knowledge, experiences, and outcomes. This can include having women and men monitors and data collectors, but also considering focus groups in local communities to make sure there are facilitators of those workshops and focus groups to really that they feel comfortable with and sharing their information so that we're collecting accurate data. It is of course important to collect disaggregated data considering the intersectionalities such as gender, age, race, income, etc. And equally important and often overlooked is the valuable contribution of qualitative information. So not just quantitative information, especially on gender. This is a key component that can be overlooked. On impact and learning as our next phase, which is the last phase in this cycle, again, reiterating that is an iterative process and much of this can be ongoing during the implementation, monitoring, evaluation as well. But this is where the process of gender mainstreaming and the gender differentiated impacts can be assessed and shared. Here we often see that gender is not included in monitoring and evaluation reporting because it is not seen as contributing to the outcomes of an environmental or sustainable natural resource project or policy. But this will go a long way in supporting additional data and information collection to have reflection and then also the documentation. Even if they're not success stories, a lot of the times the challenges and gaps are really important in supporting information for what then can be done in the next stage or the next iteration of a project moving forward. So developing that reporting tool and communication tools to build knowledge and capacity again is very important. And this will of course contribute to the cyclical process, resulting in stronger and enhanced gender mainstreaming implementation and our outcomes. So another quick question, last one I have for you all. Another true or false, sharing best practices and lessons learned on gender is an important part of the project cycle. Is this true or false? All right, just a bit more to have a few more responses from people. This would be the part sharing the learnings so that we can incorporate them into the next part of a project or policy. Okay, great. Everyone is on board, recognizing that this is very important. Sharing information on what approaches worked and what did not can help inform the needed modifications to current projects and future projects. And it also helps build awareness on the importance of gender mainstreaming. So that was a very quick and dirty rundown of the different stages and phases of the project cycle or policy development. And so what we want to do now is actually have some breakout groups with you. We have a lot of people online. I'm so excited to see this. And I haven't been able to actually watch the questions, but I've been seeing lots of things pop up. So hopefully there is some good discussion to be had amongst ourselves. We want to give ourselves a bit of a smaller group space so that we can all engage in this. So each breakout group now, you will be assigned automatically into that. There, a pop-up will come and you just click to go into the group. We're going to have 3 different sections of the project cycle from planning, design, and implementation, and we're going to hold off on those other 2 still. So you will be put in a group for planning, design, or implementation to discuss what key activities you could be implementing or putting into place in your country or with your work experience. So we want to make sure that we have a...
Sorry, Margot, this is Molly. I just wanted to interrupt you quickly before we do breakout groups. There may be 2 questions here that I think it would be useful to quickly answer as a full group before we go into the breakout groups from the questions that are in the chat box, if that's fine. Great. So I would welcome Melissa and Emmett if you want to turn your videos on quickly too. So thank you everyone. There's been some very interesting discussions in the chat box. And I do want to save plenty of time for the breakout groups where we could talk about some of these in more detail too. But a couple of these questions, I thought it was helpful for us all to be on the same page. So first, Emmett, I will turn it over to you. There's a question about what we mean by non-binary individuals. And so in your discussion of terms and concepts, I think it would be useful if you could expand on that idea a little bit quickly.
Sure. And, I'm getting a message privately, and I want to make sure that I point out that in the discussion, in the chat box discussion, I was just asking people to make sure that we are, paying attention to the presentation and the important information that we're giving, and that I was not trying to shut down any conversation that was happening, but rather just, move it to the discussion portion of our session. So I apologize to anyone reading in the chat if I came across as disrespectful. Now, to the question about what is non-binary. So non-binary gender is just a person or identity that does not align with the binary definitions of women or men. Non-binary, or sometimes they're referred to as third, in some areas there's third gender identities that have been around for as long as humans have been around, including in all regions of the world. And in many cultures, there's a traditional reverence and respect for these non-binary and third gender individuals. But through kind of these processes over the last several centuries of colonization and kind of globalization, it has meant that there's been a lot of, I guess, erasure or the marginalization of these identities, meaning that there's criminalization in legal aspects. There is, all sorts of social issues and marginalization and vulnerabilities that come along with these identities. So when we're talking about gender equality, again, we're talking about women and men, but we also have to consider intersex, non-binary, and yes, so I'm also reading a question right now. From what I'm understanding, there's a separation between gender and sex. So for non-binary individuals identify with a sex. As we talked about, sex is given at birth. So sex is something that's determined at birth. And, intersex individuals are people that are born with chromosomal patterns or, different hormone patterns that do not align with what we traditionally see as male and female. And so non-binary individuals may be intersex, but they may not be. Non-binary is a gender term, and intersex is a sex term, along with female and male. And then gender terms are non-binary, women, men, and then there are, designations around the world that differ. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emmett. And a related question, I'm actually going to send two questions over to Melissa. So first, maybe the related question. So we've had some questions about, we've been discussing gender inequality and different societal barriers that play a role in the fisheries sector, leading to differences for, access to resources, opportunities, financing for men and women. There's also a question about the role that biological sex may play in inequalities within the fisheries sector. So I'll just provide a very quick answer from sort of my own experience, and then turn it over to Melissa with a different question too for you, Melissa. But one aspect of biological sex that plays a role in a sector like fisheries has to do with equipment. So for example, my sister worked in a field where she required a lot of protective equipment, and she is a very small person and a small woman, so there was often not protective equipment, life jackets, safety glasses, helmets, things like that. They were often not available in a size that was appropriate for her. So that's one aspect. And I know in the comments, someone also mentioned, use of machinery. So things like that can play a role in the physicality of these types of jobs is very useful. Also considering youth. And one aspect of that is access to financing to be able to acquire that type of equipment. So Melissa, if you have any additional thing to add to this. And also, Melissa, there was a question about open vessels and how these can accommodate women who want to be involved in fisheries. And I think this will be the last question then before we get into the breakout rooms.
Great, thanks, Molly. Yeah, so I think that, so my answer is related to both questions, but you know, there are a lot of gender-based barriers for women to be employed on open fishing vessels. Some of those are, you know, just the general conditions aboard aren't favorable to women. So not only what Molly talked about, some of the equipment, safety equipment, or, you know, machinery, things like that, but also, you know, just lack of private sanitation facilities. And in some instances, since these vessels are typically male dominated, some women might just not feel safe in that male dominated environment. There's also sometimes instances where, you know, women are on board to fish, but they're kind of treated as cooks or cleaners and not really given the opportunity to fish and take on that role. So I think to try and overcome some of those barriers, some of the things that, you know, a fishing vessel could do is to, of course, first ensure safety on board. This could include establishing or utilizing a code of conduct at sea that all fishers and crew agree to, and then also an accountability mechanism for following up on that conduct. And then also ensuring that there are sanitation facilities that are appropriate for women, ensuring that there is some sort of privacy on board to accommodate both women and men. And then I think that as well, some of these, you know, gender norms, you know, that women aren't fishers and they're responsible for cleaning and cooking. I think that that could be overcome by just educating everybody on board and ensuring that women's roles are really well defined and understood before going out at sea. And, you know, coming to an agreement that, you know, this is what, you know, these women are there to do on board, and they're not responsible for this, but are responsible for this. So I think just having that clear communication and agreement and education upfront is really important.
Great, thank you, Melissa. There are a few other questions in the chat, which we are noting, and we'll do our best to respond either later on in this session, or we could follow up with some responses as well. So please continue to use the chat box to ask any questions you may have. And I just wanted to note too that these might be brand new topics to you, brand new concepts. So, you know, embrace the fact that it might be new and challenging and different. And it's completely okay and normal, and we're really glad that there are questions on these, because it's a complicated, it can be a really complicated topic, especially if it's new to you. So we're hoping that even if this is a new topic, that this is, you know, opening your minds a little bit to the different ways that gender plays a role in the fisheries sector. And all of you have your own personal experiences as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Margot for the breakout rooms. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Yeah, sounds like a great conversation going on. And I just want to reiterate what Molly was saying and also highlight, this is also why you may be aware that this Thursday we have an additional session that's kind of a bonus session, if you will, with some regional gender experts. We have UN Women, who is going to share a lot of their perspective and work that they've been doing in the region on gender equality and the linkages recently with fisheries and more with natural resource management they've been working on. And also a professor who has had a lifetime of research in academia and will be really great people to have this conversation, continue this conversation with, and share some of these other nuanced questions, which I think will be really great. But in the sake of time, we are going to break out into these groups. We have just 35 minutes left for this session. So we want to be able to give ourselves 25 minutes in the session, and we'll have 10 minutes to come back. The reason we want to have 10 minutes to come back to this full group is that we would like to ask to have a recorder in the groups, and then that person, or if someone else would like to be the reporter back in that group when we come back to the full group to share just 2 or 3 key points from the discussion that we're going to have. And I think that, you know, you can see the questions up here in our group, what we're going to discuss. We're going to have the planning, design, and implementation stages, as I said. So within that, based on the different entry points that we shared, what can we come up with are really tangible, specific pieces that you could be doing, whatever your role may be, whether it be in a government, in civil society, as a fisherfolk person, what are those entry points? So without further ado, let's go ahead and break into these groups. Melissa, Emmett, Molly, and I will be facilitating each of those, so we will be in there with you. And if someone wants to go ahead and raise their hand when we get into those groups to volunteer to be the recorder or report back person, that would be greatly appreciated, or we will prompt you again when we are in there. So we will see you soon in each of the groups and come back again for a kind of wrap up discussion and move into the next session.
Maybe let's start with my group then, because we were discussing the planning section. So if someone in my group would like to provide just any feedback, I know we only had a couple minutes to dive into the questions too. We didn't end up picking a recorder, which I warned you that I would call on someone if we didn't. So I'm going to call on Narissa if you would mind sharing just briefly any reflections from what we discussed in the planning group, and then I'm here with you so I can add to it as well.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, yeah. So, we spoke about, we didn't really have much time to delve into the questions, but it did come out that there was need for a policy on gender and a willingness by the planners and even at the higher levels, political maybe, or even at the directorate levels, to include gender mainstreaming in project planning and project design, and that would actually filter down across the project cycle and facilitate easier implementation later on. So those are some of the things. Some persons also spoke about the need for financing and ensuring that there was adequate funds to support gender mainstreaming. I think, did I forget anything? I'm not sure.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Narissa, and I appreciate you being willing to just be called on. So I'll just add a tiny bit to thank my group for the discussion, and thank you for humoring me with a little bit of an icebreaker. And so a big part of the discussion was financing, and so in the planning phase, it's really important to include the financial obligations really for what is required for gender mainstreaming, and to be able to include that right in the beginning. We also talked about considering women along the full supply chain, and that the gender analysis that we do nice and early in the planning phase can contribute to the lessons we can learn about where men and women are within the value chain and looking at it as a full cycle. So if anyone else from this planning group has any comments, you're welcome to add them. And then I think I'm going to turn it over to the design phase group.
Hi, everyone. So our group was looking at the design phase, and we had a pretty good discussion. So I just wanted to, before I jump in, to invite some of the participants from my group to share some of the things that we were talking about, perhaps related to what are the first question, what are some of the gender responsive approaches in this stage of the project cycle, if someone from my group wants to jump in. Maybe.
Melissa, would you be able to share your screen?
Sure, I can share my screen. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, so I just dive in for just the top, and what we were saying is that but what we would be need is to do is to identify the target audience, the stakeholders, and identify their needs as well as their contribution, and what are the constraints and challenges they may be achieving. They would need to achieve their goals that would come in achieving their goals. Also, what are some of the opportunities, the challenges and opportunities to ensure gender responsiveness. And I think this is particularly in terms of if there was, that the person at the top should be aware or have an interest in gender so that the gender perspective could be infused. There may be some resistance to gender because of a lack of understanding of or what it means to have gender in your project. And so therefore we would have to do some sensitization so that everybody can have some kind of buy-in. And of course there would be challenges, and you know, in one particular person was saying that, you know, there's the challenge of adding gender seem to be more work, and that, you know, it's more work for the implementers. And so we have to look at that and the complexity of the analysis, really breaking it down and understanding it. And I'll stop there and give somebody else a chance for the second question.
Sure, if anyone wants to just jump in real quick.
In terms of the second questions, what resources are needed to facilitate this approach, the group had discussed that there was a need to have a gender expert or gender experts to show how to incorporate a gender perspective into the project, and that it would also include the training of the staff who are going to implement the project, so to bring them up to the level where they will be able to impart their skills. Also, the need that for M&E person, but the M&E person would also need to be trained in gender, as the M&E starts not just at the beginning, but throughout the entire project. And then because the projects are usually linked to financial resources, that you will need to identify the financial resources for the sustainability of the project.
Great, thank you so much, Patricia. I'm going to turn it over. I mean, we had some more questions, but since we're kind of low on time here, I'll pass it over to Margot's group, who we're working on implementation.
Yeah, great. Those are great points from both groups. So glad to hear. Sounds like some really great discussions going on and ideas. That's excellent. We too had some great feedback more on actually what some countries and stakeholders have been able to do in the implementation phase, which we kind of discussed then as why that's important and how that's really working to advance gender mainstreaming. And I also got to call on someone because no one volunteered. Olivia, do you want to go ahead and share back a few points if you took notes?
Yeah, no problem.
Great, thanks.
All right, so for our implementation phase, one of the first points was stakeholder engagement, but not just as consultations with all the different departments together, which is also good. But I also mentioned about meeting with the different sectors and departments on a one-on-one. Well, now it's virtually, but you meet with them to really get a gist of what the department is about and a better understanding of how you could bring gender mainstreaming into that sector or that department. From Anguilla, we got contribution explaining about special training for the wives and the daughters to teach them to ID the fish, since they assist in the marketing of the fish. Therefore, it would be a good idea to teach them how to ID, and also it will contribute to data collection and have them play a key role in the value chain. From Antigua, we got contribution explaining about training champions, someone that could push the cause, someone that people look up to, they represent the fisheries industry. So we thought that was a good idea also. And lastly, also from Anguilla, we had a point of, they had focus workshops on safety. And with that workshop, because just to capture everyone, they invited the fishermen to the workshops, but sometimes they would send the wives, the girlfriends, or another representative. So that helped in everybody being part of the process and being trained and building capacity. And they also mentioned that they do have a family membership and an individual membership for the fisheries industry. So that's what I got. Back to you, Margot.
Great, thank you so much, Olivia. Yeah, we just had a couple other points that I grabbed from the chat box too about trainings, more trainings, and specific trainings like was mentioned for women and children involved in the fishing families as well. And I love that point about having family membership to the Fisher Folk organization. So thank you so much, Susan, and everybody in my group for sharing as well. In the interest of time, I think we are going to wrap this up unless anyone has any really pressing point that they wanted to make that they think is just a really revolutionary, exciting opportunity that could be implemented for integrating gender, recognizing that the other group, maybe there were some technical challenges, but we apologize for that, and hopefully won't have that happen again. Not to worry, this is the new world we all are living in. Okay, great. So just a few last points then that I want to make sure for us going forward. Just a huge thank you for participating today. We had a really great turnout, and also all of you that have stayed online for this 2-hour session. We know 2 hours is a good chunk of time to spend during your day online with us, and we really, really appreciate your participation and value your contributions. And I just really want to quickly share that, this is a space that doing this online learning and capacity building, and we want to make sure that everybody is being fair and inclusive and not, sending any negative feedback to other participants in the space, because we really want to support everyone being able to share their views. And we recognize, of course, all the knowledge that you all have in this space. And that is, of course, why we are engaging you, and also are engaging Caribbean gender experts on Thursday. So you will get to hear from them some really great insights on their work over the past decades, but also current projects going on. Another piece that was shared in my group was, the importance of different projects that are ongoing, where there are synergies that we could get on and collaborate with. Speaking of the Engender project that is going on in many of the countries where I think we have participants online today. So they'll be sharing about that, and then also the linkages with fisheries projects as well with climate change projects. And so we welcome your participation in that. Molly just dropped into the chat box the link for that if you have not if you have not registered for that as well. And then keep in mind also the main session number 2, which is at the same time next week, next Tuesday, as we had this session. We're going to dive in there a bit into the monitoring evaluation cycle and phase, more specifically, sharing a lot of detailed information on indicators and that process. And then also highlighting the gender action plan that was developed for CRFM, Secretariat and member states such as yourselves. We will highlight the different priority areas and areas of action. And then also next Thursday following, we will have a webinar that highlights practitioners in the area of gender and fisheries, which we are really excited to share with you the different activities and entry points that they've been able to get in, integrating gender into the work that they've been undertaking, kind of a step more focused on those practices as we were just discussing in our groups to continue this conversation. So I think with that, we will go ahead and close this session. As we shared in the beginning, we will send out the slides that we have for this. We, of course, welcome the use of these. That's another piece. We want to make sure that everybody has the tools for this. And then also we'll share an online recording such as this. So for colleagues that you think would like to participate or watch this recording as well. And I'm sorry, is someone trying to speak? Okay. And then we, is there anything else that I'm missing? Sorry, Emmett or Molly or Melissa, that we will be sharing. And we will follow up, of course, also with more links for the registrations and reminders for next week's sessions. But we look forward to your participation in that and hope everyone enjoyed, and we will see you on Thursday and next week. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day. We'll talk soon.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.